today's episode, I want to talk about hyper independence. And listen, before you click out and go to another episode, I really need you to stay and listen to what I have to say. I really need you to pick up what I'm putting down because I cannot emphasize how much entrepreneurs, especially, the high powered, high ambition, like high performing entrepreneurs, especially women of color, really end up fumbling the bag because their hyper independence is too much in their business. So we're gonna get into that in this episode, but I really want to start off by really talking about the difference between independence and hyper independence, right? Because I don't think there's nothing wrong with being independent. And right now, I'm like in my mind, I have like the Destiny's Child song, and like that was like the anthem at one point, right? I think it's something that is an incredible tool, right? It's like not a bad thing, but then there's hyper independence, and hyper independence is kind of an extreme form of independence. It's this way of being where you're overly self-reliant to the point that it's to your detriment, right? You actively, not like just like in a passive way, but you actively avoid relying on others, asking for help or assistance, especially in moments where not asking for help could be to your detriment, right? Like it's think about it as independence that negatively impacts you. Like that's a problem, right? That's not like the independent, I can figure things out. I don't necessarily have to like wait for someone to get things done, being well resourced. And like that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about folks who behave in ways where you're actively going away from getting support, right? Or seeking support. And I just want to be real here that hyper independence can be a trauma response when someone learns from a traumatic experience, right? When we think about trauma, I like to think about it as too much too fast, right? Given a traumatic experience, you learn that you can't rely on other people for protection or support. Okay. It's an experience that tells you that the world is unsafe, right? That people cannot be trusted, that the only person that you can trust is yourself. And I just want to pause here for a second and give a caveat, which is that not all hyper independent behaviors are brought on by trauma, just like not everyone who experiences trauma develops hyper independence, right? So just wanted to make sure that that is super clear here. And so the other thing that I want to share here about hyper independent, as someone who was very, very hyper independent, we tend to be parentified as kids, meaning that as kids, we were in a role where our parents looked to us to meet their needs, right? And that could have been like their emotional needs, right? It could have been their co parenting needs. Another caveat here that I want to share is that, I'm always super finicky with language because I really hate this term, parentification, because I think it can come off as judgy and blame the parents as if, if parents were well resourced, would they really look to their kids for their needs? Absolutely not, right? And I think that that term doesn't always take in the systemic realities, right? I think that westernized, this Eurocentric way of viewing psychology is whacked, right? And what's pathologized in the Western world sometimes is very much standard and welcomed and celebrated in other communities, Nevertheless, to kind of drive this point home, I just want to share like a quick story. I have this memory of, being a kid. I must have been like 5 or something. And I went with my paternal grandma to the doctor's office. And I remember like translating for her. And, I remember it being like super cute and people saying, oh my God, you're so smart. You're like wise beyond your years. Mind you, I was like 5 or 6. I mean, I don't know. I'm just like guessing here in age. I was very young. And sure, it was like maybe cute, but it was 100% not developmentally appropriate. Right. I also wonder if, doctors' offices, had translators in predominantly Latinx neighborhoods, if there wouldn't even been a need for me to step up in that way, right? Like, probably not. And so, this is what I mean by words and terms kind of being, culturally sanctioned, widely used, that isn't always like critically thought about. And so, that's what I'll say about that, because that could totally be its own other episode. But all this to say that a lot of times when we become hyper independent, we are put in those types of roles from an early age, right? And, not being able to depend on a primary caregiver for whatever reason, right? Not like blaming or judging or anything like that, but like not being able to depend on a primary caretaker creates deep wounds. And those wounds like deeply impact how you relate to others, sure, but definitely and more importantly how you relate and you view yourself. Okay, when a little mind and a little body doesn't have a supportive, dependable person to guide, nurture, and protect them, they're not thinking about the circumstances that led their primary caretaker to be unavailable. Their brains aren't even developed, right? At that point to even think that way. What that little mind and body thinks is that there's something wrong with them, right? And that because there's something wrong with them, that caused this person, this caretaker, to be unavailable for them. Okay. And so that's just what happens. And so when that little mind and that little body grows into adult, right, into adulthood, what do you think happens? They become this hyper independent person that can figure things out, right? They're typically the quote unquote strong friend. They are characterized by the trope, of the strong Black woman, right? And they become hyper independent in all areas of their lives, not just in their friendships, but definitely in love, and for sure, like, because I think it's very conducive to this in your careers and in your businesses, right? We don't pick and choose the areas of our lives that we're hyper independent. If you're hyper independent in business, if you're hyper independent in your relationships, you're the same way in love. You're the same way in your relationships, because there's a fundamental distrust in anyone that isn't yourself. Sure, maybe you're a little, right, less hyper independent in some areas, but the hyper independence is still there anyway, right? Because fundamentally, there is a belief that you can't trust other people, right? And so here's the thing: you're an entrepreneur, you're independent, obviously, you're free from control of an employer, of a system, right? You can think of yourself as a free agent in a way, but are you really? You're not. Hate to break it to you, but you're not. You can have your own business, you can be making all types of money, and have all types of experiences, and be living the quote unquote dream. But if you're hyper independent, you're not really free. Why? Because you're actually bound to your pain. You're bound to whatever trauma caused you to become hyper independent in the first place. It's a false sense of freedom. And when you're an entrepreneur, right, that is going to seep into how you make decisions. It's going to seep into how you hire. It's going to seep into how you lead your clients, right? Hyper independence is a problem. Okay. And sure, it might have served you for a certain season, it might have gotten you to this place, but mark my words, it is going to cause you to fumble the bag. It's not a good business strategy, and it's going to become a problem. Now, I want to highlight two very real ways that this hyper independence sneaks up for entrepreneurs. And I'm going to share a very like practical way and a more sneaky way, right? That is really embedded in your belief system and in your unconscious, subconscious, right? So practically, hyper independence can look like, you hiring help and, joining a mastermind or joining a business coaching program, or even hiring a coach but not asking for help, right? I've definitely been there. I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it. When I first joined the business coaching program, I thought I had to show up like already knowing what I was there to learn. I don't know if that's been your experience, but that was definitely my experience. And so like I really had to have like a moment where I was like, girl, what are we doing here? Like what are you really paying for here? Like really give yourself an opportunity to be supported here. It also looks like hiring people and then micromanaging them, right? And again, it's driven by this idea of distrust, right? Like if I ask for help, if I put myself out there, because of course asking for help is vulnerable, if I put myself out there, I am going to be let down. Why? Because you're operating from outdated information. You were let down before. Yeah, sure, that happened. You're not making that up. But is that really the case now, right? Can you really resource yourself so that that doesn't happen? Can you develop discernment so that that doesn't happen, right? So that's like one very like real practical way that your hyper independence can like really get in the way of what you want to achieve. And then there's like the deeper, sneakier stuff, right? It's your belief system. And I find, especially for entrepreneurs of color, that there is a belief that asking for help makes you less of a capable entrepreneur. Like, mind blowing. All of the most successful people, entrepreneurs or not, that they're community made, right? They didn't get there alone. Like I think about like Rihanna, for example, and there's been so much written, not just on like her and but like other people, but like Rihanna was mentored by Jay-Z. Sure, she's a talent, right? Like Jay-Z was not out here singing her songs, right? But there was mentorship there. There was someone supporting her, right? I'm sure there were many other people supporting her, but asking for help, recognizing that you need help, that you need support, that you need another perspective does not make you any less of a capable entrepreneur. It makes you a smart one. And again, I want to go back to this very unique experience as folks of color, people of the global majority, right? We don't always grow up with access and networks, right? That are a lot of times embedded for our white peers in their communities, right? Or in our communities, asking for help is just something that is seen negatively, right? Something that is seen as weakness, even. So like we have to like the reason why I'm bringing this up is because of context, right? Like we don't exist in silos. We don't exist in a vacuum. We really have to understand that when we show up as entrepreneurs, we don't just show up as entrepreneurs. We show up as entrepreneurs with all of our social locations and all of our identities. And so we have to really be cognizant of the ways that these identities and these lived experiences, right? Because we experience the world based on our lived experiences, that these lived experiences also impact how we show up as entrepreneurs, right? It shows up in the ways that we resource ourselves or the ways that we don't resource ourselves. And so, in this way, if it's not yet abundantly clear, hyper independence ends up being a liability in our businesses. It ends up being a risk, a major, major risk for us as entrepreneurs because it inherently limits how far we can go. And we've all heard, the saying. I think it's a African proverb, right? That if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together, right? as entrepreneurs of color, we need to embrace this more. We really need to like stop wearing this like hyper independence as a badge of honor. And listen, again, like I used to be that way. I get it. It was like I just it used to fill me up to be able to say, yeah, I figured this out on my own. But y'all, that shit has come at a cost. It has come at a cost. And I am no longer willing to pay that price. It's just not worth it. And you know, if you follow me on social, if you've been listening to my podcast, I know that you've probably heard me say this often. I refuse to do hard things alone. Why? I no longer need to do that. Right? And so I'm just not going to. If there is any opportunity for me to grow something big, create something that is going to have a legacy, not only for my like my family, my lineage, but in this world, I want to do it with people. There's nothing cute about doing things alone. Okay. And yes, I know that certain circumstances might cause you to have to do things alone, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about those instances where we are choosing to do things alone when we no longer have to. Okay. If you came to entrepreneurship already hyper independent, I really want to invite you to find the resources so that you can heal the wound that made you behave in that way in the first place. We are not born hyper independent. It is a response to something. And when we become entrepreneurs, again, it becomes a risk and a liability. When you don't resource yourself in that way, right? When you don't go towards the help, when you don't heal the wounds that made you become hyper independent in the first place, you end up running in circles. And that is no way to create the legacy that you want. I hope that this has been helpful. I have a strong feeling that if you're listening to this podcast, that if you're listening to this episode, you are probably hyper independent yourself. Again, this is nothing to be ashamed of. This is nothing to judge yourself about. This is just something that needs to be dissolved and metabolized into something else. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you next week.